In the 1970s, a new kind of suburban dream was taking root in California. Families flocked to quiet neighborhoods, seeking peace and security. Streets were lined with manicured lawns. Children played outside until dusk. It was a picture of American optimism. The sun-drenched days felt endless, filled with possibility. But as the sun went down, a darkness began to creep in. A fear, at first unspoken, started to poison the tranquil nights. Something was wrong in the Golden State. A shadow was moving through the very communities built to keep danger out. This was not a specter from a horror film. It was a man, real and terrifyingly human. He moved silently through backyards. He peered into windows, watching families live their lives. He learned their routines. He learned their habits. He learned their vulnerabilities. The safety of a locked door became a cruel illusion. He was a phantom who could be anywhere and everywhere. He was a predator who hunted in the most ordinary of places. The very idea of home began to crumble under the weight of his unseen presence. It was replaced by a constant, nagging anxiety. This presence began as a whisper, a string of strange and unsettling crimes. A house would be broken into, but nothing of value seemed to be taken. Personal items were moved. Personal items were rearranged. Personal items were stolen. Single women's underwear drawers were rifled through. These were not simple burglaries. They were acts of violation. They were designed to instill a deep and personal sense of dread. The intruder wasn't just taking things. He was leaving a message. He showed his victims and the community he could enter their private spaces at will. He was demonstrating his power over them. The police were baffled. The crimes were bizarre, erratic, and lacked a clear motive. They called him the Visalia Ransacker. He was a ghost, leaving behind little more than confusion and fear. But this was only the beginning. The ransacking was a rehearsal. The petty thefts and strange intrusions were practice. The shadow was learning, evolving, and growing bolder with each successful invasion. Soon, the violation of property would no longer be enough to satisfy his dark impulses. The terror he created was about to take on a far more violent and horrifying form. The quiet terror of the ransacker soon gave way to a new and more brutal chapter. The shadow that had merely watched from the darkness now stepped into the light of the bedroom. The crimes escalated from strange burglaries to violent sexual assaults. He targeted couples in their own homes in the dead of night. His methods were calculated and cruel. He would bind the man placing dishes on his back. He would threaten to kill the woman if he heard the plates rattle. It was a twisted psychological game designed to maximize terror and helplessness for his victims. This new monster was given a new name: the East Area Rapist. His reign of terror spread across the Sacramento area, a dark cloud hanging over dozens of communities. His attacks were meticulously planned. He would often call his victims beforehand, taunting them with whispers, taunting them with heavy breathing. He would call them afterward, reliving the horror he had inflicted upon them. He was not just a criminal committing a crime, he was a sadist who fed on the fear he created. He was a phantom who haunted the phone lines as much as he haunted the night. The violence did not stop there. As the years passed, his attacks grew even more savage. Rape escalated to murder. The East Area Rapist became the original Night Stalker, leaving a trail of death from Northern California to Southern California. The man who began by stealing trinkets from empty houses was now taking lives. Law enforcement agencies in different counties were chasing what they thought were separate criminals. They did not yet know they were all hunting the same man, a single, prolific predator who had managed to evade capture for over a decade. This one man was responsible for at least 13 murders, more than 50 rapes, and over 100 burglaries. He was a ghost who changed his methods and his hunting grounds, always staying one step ahead of the law. For decades, he would remain a mystery, a faceless name tied to California's darkest crimes. But the silent witness to his evil was always there, left behind at every scene. It was a microscopic clue woven into the very fabric of life. It was DNA, and it would wait patiently for technology to catch up to the truth. The story of the Phantom begins not in the sprawling suburbs of Sacramento, but in the smaller agricultural town of Visalia. Here, in the early 1970s, a strange pattern of crimes began to emerge. Over 100 burglaries were reported, but these were not ordinary break-ins. The intruder was meticulous, he was careful. He seemed less interested in material wealth and more interested in something else entirely. He was a voyeur, an invader of private worlds. He was learning his craft, honing the skills he would later use to inflict unimaginable suffering. This was the first iteration of the monster, a shadowy figure they called the Visalia Ransacker. His methods were deeply unsettling. He would bypass simple locks, finding clever and quiet ways to enter a home. Once inside, he would not just steal, he would rearrange. He would rummage through personal belongings, creating a scene of controlled chaos. He took items of little monetary value but immense personal significance. Wedding rings, photographs, intimate apparel. This was not about profit, it was about power. It was about showing his victims that he had been in their most sacred spaces, that he knew their secrets, and that they were utterly powerless to stop him. The ransackings were a form of psychological warfare. The families of Visalia lived in a state of constant unease. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow moving past a window could be him. The fear was palpable. He was a ghost who left behind a trail of violation, a chilling reminder that no home was truly safe. The police were frustrated, chasing a suspect who left few clues and seemed to have no rational motive. They could not know these burglaries were merely a rehearsal for a far darker performance yet to come. The ransacker was testing his limits, growing bolder with every successful intrusion. Then, the pattern shifted. The ransacker's curiosity turned to violence. One night, he was interrupted during a burglary. A college professor, Claude Snelling, confronted the intruder who was attempting to kidnap his daughter. In the struggle that followed, Snelling was shot and killed. This was a critical turning point. The Phantom, who had only stolen objects and peace of mind, had now taken a life. The Visalia ransacker's reign of terror abruptly ended after this murder. He vanished from the area as suddenly as he had appeared. But he did not disappear. He merely moved, taking his terrifying skills to a new, larger stage. The shadow re-emerged in 1976. This time, it was in the suburbs east of Sacramento. The quiet middle-class neighborhoods of Carmichael, Citrus Heights, Rancho Cordova became his new hunting grounds. The bizarre burglaries of Visalia had evolved into something far more sinister. The Phantom was no longer content to simply watch from the shadows or rearrange personal items. He now craved a more direct and brutal form of violation. He began breaking into homes at night, not to steal, but to assault. The community would soon come to know him by a new and terrifying name: the East Area Rapist. His attacks were marked by a chilling level of preparation. He was a predator who stalked his prey meticulously. He would prowl neighborhoods for weeks, sometimes months, before striking. He learned the layouts of the homes. He knew the daily routines of the people inside. He often disabled porch lights and unlocked patio doors days in advance, preparing his entry. Victims would later report strange hang-up phone calls in the weeks leading up to their attack. It was him, listening, confirming they were home, savoring their unknowing vulnerability before he made his move. The terror began long before he ever crossed the threshold. His method of attack was designed to inflict maximum psychological trauma. He almost always targeted couples. Once inside, he would use a flashlight to blind and disorient them. He would bind the man and threaten him, often placing a stack of dishes on his back. He would then whisper a chilling promise. If the dishes rattled, he would kill everyone in the house. This cruel tactic ensured the man was forced into a state of paralyzed helplessness while the attacker assaulted the woman, often for hours. He was not just a rapist. He was a torturer who reveled in the control and fear he could command. The East Area Rapist's reign of terror paralyzed the community. Gun sales soared, neighborhood watch groups formed. Families fortified their homes, adding new locks and alarms. But the attacks continued. He was a phantom who could seemingly bypass any defense. He was brazen, sometimes lingering in the house after the assault, eating food from the refrigerator as his victims lay bound and terrified. Then, just as in Visalia, he would vanish back into the night, leaving behind a wave of trauma and a community gripped by an unshakable fear of the dark. He was a monster hiding in plain sight. The East Area Rapist was more than just a criminal. He was a hunter. His movements were fluid and unpredictable, making him incredibly difficult to track. He would strike in one neighborhood, then disappear for weeks, only to surface miles away in a completely different jurisdiction. This pattern confused law enforcement, who were operating in separate silos with limited information sharing. They were chasing dozens of leads, but they were all looking for a local suspect. They didn't yet understand they were dealing with a phantom who treated county lines as invisible, irrelevant boundaries in his vast and terrifying hunting ground. The psychological torment did not end with the physical assault. One of his most sadistic signatures was the taunting phone call. Days after an attack, victims would receive a call. Weeks after an attack, victims would receive a call. Even months after an attack, victims would receive a call. Sometimes it was just heavy, menacing breathing on the other end of the line.
I'm going to kill you.
He was reliving his crimes, feeding off the renewed fear he could inspire with just his voice. He was still out there. He remembered them. He could reach them at any time. The violation was ongoing, a wound he refused to let heal. His knowledge of police procedure was uncanny. When law enforcement organized town hall meetings to calm the public, to share information, the attacks would often spike in the surrounding areas. It was as if he was listening in, using their own efforts against them. He seemed to know their patrol routes and their response times. He moved with a confidence and arrogance that suggested he felt untouchable. This led some investigators to believe he might have a law enforcement or military background. He was not just outsmarting his victims, he seemed to be outsmarting the very people who were hunting him. For 2 years, he terrorized community after community, from Sacramento down to the East Bay area. He was a whisper in the dark, a faceless demon spoken of in hushed tones. Police sketches were produced, but they were inconsistent, showing a man who could be anyone. He was a ghost in the system, a collection of case files spread across a dozen different police departments. The fear he created was immense, but his identity remained a complete mystery. The hunter was a master of his domain, and his thirst for violence was far from quenched. His dark evolution was about to take its deadliest turn. It was getting worse. In 1979, the Phantom moved south. His reign of terror left the Sacramento area and descended upon Southern California, Santa Barbara, Orange County. With this geographic shift came a horrifying escalation in violence. The attacks were no longer just rapes, they became savage murders. The man who had been known as the East Area Rapist now earned a new, more lethal title, the original Night Stalker. The game had changed. The monster who had been content to terrorize and violate his victims was now intent on silencing them forever. The final act of his dark saga had begun. The attacks in Southern California followed a similar terrifying pattern, but with a fatal conclusion. He continued to target couples in their homes, breaking in while they slept. But now, after binding the victims, after assaulting the victims, he would bludgeon them to death or shoot them to death. The murders were brutal, frenzied, and left behind horrific crime scenes. The Phantom was no longer just a sadist who fed on fear. He was now a cold-blooded killer. Each new double murder sent waves of panic through the affluent coastal communities, places where people believed they were safe. Law enforcement in Southern California was facing the same problem their northern counterparts had. They were investigating a series of brutal home invasion murders, but they saw them as isolated local crimes. The connection to the long string of rapes in Northern California was not immediately apparent. The different jurisdictions were not communicating effectively. For years, the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were believed to be two separate, equally terrifying criminals. No one yet knew they were hunting a single man who had been active for nearly a decade, leaving a trail of trauma and death across the entire state. The last known murder attributed to the original Night Stalker occurred in 1986. An 18-year-old girl was raped and killed in her home in Irvine. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the phantom vanished. The phone calls stopped. The attacks ceased. The murders ended. For years, the trail went cold. He had terrorized California for over a decade, committing at least 13 murders, more than 50 rapes, and hundreds of burglaries. He had been a ransacker, a rapist, and a killer. And then he was gone, melting back into the fabric of society, leaving behind only fear, unanswered questions, and the silent, microscopic evidence of his crimes. It was like he disappeared. After the murder in Irvine in 1986, an eerie silence fell. The phantom who had haunted California for over a decade simply vanished. The attacks stopped. The taunting phone calls ceased. The nightly terror that had gripped communities from Sacramento to Orange County faded into a painful memory. For the investigators who had spent years hunting him, it was a frustrating and abrupt end. The trail went cold, not with a clue, but with a complete and total absence. The monster had seemingly retired, leaving behind a legacy of fear and a mountain of unanswered questions. The most terrifying question of all was, where did he go? The years turned into a decade, and then another. The case files for the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker gathered dust on shelves in evidence lockers across the state. Detectives retired, taking their institutional knowledge with them. New crimes demanded the attention of law enforcement. But for the victims and for the investigators who could never let it go, the case was never truly cold. It was a wound that refused to heal, a constant nagging puzzle with a crucial piece missing. The phantom was gone, but his shadow lingered, a dark stain on the history of the Golden State that time could not wash away. This period became known as the Cold Years. It was an era of profound frustration. The different law enforcement agencies had their own suspects, their own theories, their own case files. They were still largely operating in silos, unaware that their separate monsters were one and the same. In the North, they searched for a prolific rapist. In the South, they hunted a brutal home invasion killer. They were looking at two different parts of the same horrifying picture, but they lacked the perspective to see the whole image. The killer was hiding in plain sight, protected by the very jurisdictional lines he had so easily crossed. For the public, the memory of the attacks began to fade. New headlines replaced the old ones. Life, for many, moved on. But for those who lived through it, the fear was never completely gone. It was passed down, a cautionary tale told to children about locking doors, being aware of the dark. The phantom had changed the very culture of safety in California. He had taught an entire generation that evil could live next door, that it could watch from the shadows of a quiet suburban street, and that it could strike without warning. The silence was not peace. It was an unsettling absence. Yeah, it stayed with people. Throughout the 1990s, dedicated detectives continued to work the case. They were a small, persistent group, often working in their spare time, haunted by the scale and brutality of the crimes. They would revisit old evidence, re-interview witnesses, chase down forgotten leads. But they were chasing ghosts. The suspect had been a master of evasion, leaving behind little in the way of traditional evidence. Eyewitness descriptions were varied and unreliable. He was a man of average height, average build, a face that could be anyone's. He was a specter, a blank slate onto which victims projected their terror, but he had no concrete features. The investigation was a labyrinth of dead ends. Thousands of tips had been collected over the years, leading to thousands of potential suspects. Each one had to be meticulously investigated and eventually ruled out. Investigators looked at men with military backgrounds, former police officers, known sex offenders. They chased leads across the country and even overseas, but every path led to a frustrating wall of silence. The phantom had covered his tracks perfectly. He had simply disappeared back into the anonymous fabric of society, leaving investigators to question if he was dead, in prison for another crime, or simply living a quiet life somewhere nearby. This long, frustrating period took a heavy toll on the investigators. It became a personal obsession for many, a case that defined their careers. One such detective was Larry Poole from Sacramento County. He refused to let the case die. He painstakingly compiled a massive database, linking the various attacks, creating a comprehensive timeline of the East Area Rapists' reign of terror. He saw the patterns others had missed. He believed the rapist was intelligent, organized, and likely taunting them. Poole's work was crucial, keeping the flame of the investigation alive during the darkest and coldest years of the hunt. But even with this renewed dedication, progress was agonizingly slow. The tools of the 1970s and 80s had failed to catch him. Now, investigators were armed with better databases and more sophisticated profiling techniques, but they were still missing the one piece of evidence that could definitively link the crimes and identify the perpetrator. They had his methods, his timeline, and his psychological profile. They had everything except his face and his name. The ghost remained just out of reach, a nameless entity responsible for some of the worst crimes in California's history, hidden somewhere in the quiet stillness of the cold years. As the 20th century came to a close, a revolution was quietly unfolding in forensic science. A new technology, DNA analysis, was changing the face of criminal justice. It offered a way to identify individuals with near certainty from the smallest biological traces: a drop of blood, a strand of hair, a sample of skin cells. For cold cases, it was a beacon of hope. It was a way to make old evidence speak again, to reveal secrets that had been locked away for decades. For the investigators hunting the Phantom of California, this technology would become the key that could finally unlock the mystery. The invisible thread connecting the crimes had always been there, left behind at scene after scene. The attacker had been careless, leaving his biological signature on his victims, their bedding. In the 1970s, this evidence was of limited use. But now, in the late 1990s, scientists could extract a unique genetic profile from these decades-old samples. Contra Costa County criminalist Paul Holes, another detective who would become obsessed with the case, began the painstaking work of re-examining evidence from the East Area rapist attacks, hoping to build a DNA profile of the elusive suspect. His work paid off. By 2001, Holes had successfully developed a DNA profile from evidence collected at one of the East Area rapist crime scenes in his jurisdiction. This was a monumental breakthrough. They now had the Phantom's genetic fingerprint. At the same time, investigators in Southern California were doing the same with evidence from the original Night Stalker murder scenes. The question was, would the profiles match? The moment of truth came when the two profiles were compared in the state's new DNA database. The results were undeniable. They were a perfect match. The revelation sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community. The East Area rapist and the original Night Stalker were not two different men. They were one and the same. The rapist who had terrorized Northern California had moved south and become a killer. The theory that a few dedicated detectives had long suspected was now proven beyond any doubt. All the rapes, all the murders, all the terror. It was all the work of a single, prolific predator. The cold years were not over, but a new fire had been lit under the investigation. The hunt was on for a single, faceless monster. The DNA match was a game changer. It transformed dozens of separate, stalled investigations into one massive, statewide manhunt. For the first time, law enforcement agencies from across California began to truly collaborate, sharing files, comparing notes, pooling their resources. The jurisdictional walls that had protected the killer for so long finally came tumbling down. They were no longer chasing regional ghosts. They were hunting a single entity. A serial predator who had been more active, more violent, more geographically widespread. The full, terrifying scope of his crimes was finally coming into focus. With a unified DNA profile, investigators could now definitively link crimes that had previously seemed unconnected. A rape in Sacramento, a murder in Goleta, another assault in Danville. All were now tied together by that invisible genetic thread. The case against their Phantom grew stronger with each new match. The DNA profile was entered into CODIS, the national database of known offenders, with the hope of finding a direct match. The investigators waited, but the search came back empty. Their suspect was not in the system. He was a ghost who had never been caught for any other crime. This was both a breakthrough and another frustrating dead end. They had his DNA, but they did not have his name. They knew what he had done, but they did not know who he was. The profile gave them a powerful tool to eliminate suspects, but it could not point them toward the guilty party. For another decade, the investigation would continue in this state of limbo. Investigators would test the DNA of hundreds of persons of interest. One by one, each test that came back negative was another name crossed off an impossibly long list, another small step forward in a marathon with no finish line in sight. The faceless monster now had a genetic identity, but he remained a phantom. He was living somewhere, perhaps still in California, a seemingly ordinary man hiding an extraordinarily dark secret. He could be a neighbor, a co-worker, a family man. He had blended back into society, his violent past buried deep beneath a facade of normalcy. The investigators knew they were closer than ever before. They had the killer's essence trapped in a vial, but they were still missing the final link. They needed a new tool, a new idea, something that could take that DNA profile and finally give the monster a name. For years, the DNA profile of the Golden State Killer sat in a database, a digital ghost. It was a perfect identifier with no one to identify. It cleared the innocent, but could not name the guilty. The case had hit a wall that traditional forensics could not break. But as technology evolved, so did the tools of justice. A revolutionary new technique was emerging. It blended cutting-edge science with old-fashioned genealogical research. It was called forensic genetic genealogy. It offered a radical new way to search for a suspect, not by looking for him directly, but by looking for his family. It was the long shot the investigators had been waiting for. The concept was daringly innovative. Investigators could take the killer's DNA profile, painstakingly preserved from the crime scenes, and upload it to a public genealogy website. These websites were designed for everyday people searching for their relatives and exploring their ancestry. Users would upload their own DNA data to find distant cousins and build out their family trees. By placing the killer's DNA into this vast, crowdsourced genetic library, investigators hoped to find a match, not to the killer himself, but to a distant relative, a third or fourth cousin who had submitted their DNA for personal reasons, entirely unaware of the dark connection they held. This was a profound shift in investigative strategy. It was a leap into uncharted territory, scientifically and ethically. Using a public database in this way raised new questions about genetic privacy and consent. But for the cold case team, led by the relentless Paul Holes and FBI lawyer Steve Kramer, the potential to finally solve this decades-old mystery was too great to ignore. After years of dead ends, they were willing to pioneer a new path. They decided to use a public database called GEDmatch. The site was known for tools that let users compare genetic data from different testing companies. The process began in early 2017. The team uploaded the killer's genetic data to GEDmatch, creating a phantom profile for a man who did not exist. Then, they waited. The hope was that somewhere in the database, among hundreds of thousands of users, there was someone who shared a small but significant segment of DNA with the most wanted and most elusive serial killer in California history. They were not looking for a needle in a haystack anymore. They were looking for the needle's relatives, hoping the family tree itself would become a map, branch by branch, to their phantom. They were patient and persistent. The upload to GEDmatch did not produce an immediate hit. There was no brother, no son, no first cousin. But it did return something subtle and powerful. The system flagged several users who shared DNA with the crime scene sample. They were distant relatives, likely third cousins, fourth cousins, even fifth cousins. This was the breakthrough. A faint signal, a whisper from the past, but a lead. The killer was no longer a complete ghost. He had a genetic family, a network of relatives. The next phase was genealogical detective work. A team of experts, including Barbara Ray Venter, began reverse engineering the family tree. Starting with a handful of distant cousins from GEDmatch, they pulled public records, birth certificates, death notices, census records, old newspapers. They built family trees for each match. They worked backward, searching for common ancestors. the great-great-great-grandparents who linked these relatives. A colossal puzzle with thousands of pieces. The team built sprawling family trees across centuries and the country. They searched for a single point of intersection, a common ancestral couple. After months, they found it. A 19th century couple, the common ancestors. The Golden State Killer had to be one of their descendants. The search narrowed from the whole population to one extended family. The team then built the tree forward, tracing descendants to the present. They followed every branch, every name, filtering possibilities, looking for a white male of a certain age who would have been in the right locations in California. The list shrank. Men who were too young were eliminated. Too old were eliminated. Those in the wrong places were eliminated. Finally, 2 possible suspects remained. One was ruled out. The other, Joseph James DeAngelo. The net had closed in. The name was electrifying. Joseph James DeAngelo, 72 years old, living a quiet life. Citrus Heights, a suburb of Sacramento, in the heart of the East Area, rapists' original hunting grounds. He fit the profile. He was the right age. Navy veteran, former police officer, served in 2 California departments in the 1970s. This could explain his ability to evade capture and his knowledge of law enforcement tactics. The phantom they'd chased for 40 years suddenly had a name, a face, and an address. But they still needed definitive proof. Circumstantial evidence wasn't enough. To make an arrest, they needed to match his DNA to the DNA from the crime scenes. That meant one final, crucial step: secretly obtain a sample of his DNA. Without alerting him, he was the prime suspect. A surveillance team was assembled. They watched his every move, following him through daily routines, waiting for him to discard something, anything with his genetic signature. The fate of the investigation rested on this covert operation. Surveillance was tense and methodical. The team followed him to the grocery store, the hardware store. For days he gave them nothing. He was careful, almost paranoid. Then, on April 18, 2018, they got their chance. After shopping at Hobby Lobby, he sat in his car. He blew his nose into a tissue. He tossed it into an outside trash can, the moment they'd been waiting for. An agent quickly, discreetly retrieved the discarded tissue. The tissue was rushed to the crime lab. Stakes could not have been higher. Scientists extracted a DNA profile from cells on the tissue. They compared it to the preserved profile from the crime scenes. Visalia ransacker, East Area rapist, original Night Stalker. The result? A perfect match. It was him. Joseph James DeAngelo, the grandfather, the former cop, the quiet neighbor, the faceless monster they'd hunted for 4 decades. The cold years were finally over. The phantom was about to be unmasked. And that was the turning point. The DNA match was the final piece of the puzzle. After 4 decades of darkness, investigators finally had their man. On April 24, 2018, local agencies, state agencies, and federal agencies descended on a quiet suburban street in Citrus Heights. They surrounded the modest, single-story home of Joseph James DeAngelo. The neighborhood was calm, unsuspecting. No one knew the man living in their midst was the phantom who had terrorized California for over a decade. The time had come to confront the monster in his lair, to bring him out of the shadows and into the stark light of justice. The arrest was not a dramatic, high-speed chase. It was a patient, calculated trap. Investigators waited for DeAngelo to emerge from his house. When he did, they moved in. The aging man seemed confused, caught completely off guard. He was ordered to the ground. He had once wielded absolute power over his victims. He had moved like a ghost in the night, but now he was powerless, his hands cuffed behind his back. The phantom who had haunted a generation was finally in custody. The long, cold hunt was over. The monster had been captured. The news of his arrest sent shockwaves across the country, and especially through California. The Golden State Killer, a name synonymous with faceless evil, now had a face. It was the face of a 72-year-old grandfather, a man who had lived an outwardly normal life for decades. But the most stunning revelation was his past career. D'Angelo had been a police officer in the 1970s in Exeter and Auburn, towns right in the middle of his hunting grounds. The man sworn to protect the public had been the very predator they feared. The hunter had been hiding inside the pack. As he was led away in handcuffs, a lifetime of secrets began to unravel. The unmasking was complete. The quiet neighbor was a serial killer. The cop was the criminal. The phantom was finally real. As Joseph D'Angelo sat in a jail cell, the legal process began. The sheer scale of his crimes presented a monumental challenge. The charges spanned multiple counties and covered a period of more than 12 years. Prosecutors from 6 different counties joined forces to build an unshakable case against him. He was charged with 13 counts of murder with special circumstances, murder during a burglary, rape. He was also charged with 13 counts of kidnapping and robbery. The statute of limitations for the dozens of rapes he committed had long expired, but the pain of those crimes would form the moral core of the case against him. In the courtroom, the world saw a different D'Angelo. He was no longer the defiant phantom or the surprised old man from the arrest. He appeared frail, confused, and weak. He was brought into the courtroom in a wheelchair, often looking vacant and unresponsive. He would whisper to his lawyers, claiming he didn't have the strength to stand. Many saw this as a final pathetic act, a last-ditch attempt to manipulate the system. It was a mask of weakness, just as his police uniform had once been a mask of authority. Faced with a mountain of irrefutable DNA evidence and the prospect of a lengthy, grueling trial that would force his many victims to relive their trauma on the stand, D'Angelo agreed to a plea deal. In June of 2020, he admitted his guilt. In a cavernous university ballroom converted into a courtroom to accommodate the large number of victims and their families, he confessed. As part of the deal, he pleaded guilty to 13 murders and admitted to dozens of uncharged rapes and burglaries. In a monotone voice, he answered "guilty and I admit" again and again as a prosecutor read the details of each horrific crime. The confession was a stunning moment. For decades, he had been a faceless name, a collection of case files. Now, he was giving voice to his own evil. He admitted to being the Visalia ransacker. He admitted to being the East Area rapist. He admitted to being the original Night Stalker. The plea deal ensured he would die in prison, sparing the victims a traumatic trial. But it also set the stage for something even more powerful, a chance for the survivors to finally confront the man who had stolen their peace, their safety, and their loved ones, and to speak their truth directly to the face of evil. The sentencing hearing in August 2020 was not just a legal formality. It was a reckoning. For 3 days, the courtroom became a stage for the survivors. One by one, they stood and faced the man who had haunted their lives for more than 40 years. They were no longer the terrified victims he had left bound in the dark. They were strong. They were defiant. They were a chorus of voices that had refused to be silenced by time or by trauma. They spoke of the loved ones they had lost, the fear they had endured, and the lives that had been forever altered by his violence. Their words were a powerful testament to human resilience. They described the long-term impact of his crimes. The years of therapy, the shattered relationships, the constant fear. A daughter spoke of the father he murdered. A woman spoke of the night he violated her in her own bed. They called him a coward, a monster, and a pathetic shell of a man. They reclaimed the power he had stolen from them, not with violence, but with the undeniable truth of their own stories. They were no longer defined by what he had done to them. They were defined by their survival. Throughout the emotional testimony, D'Angelo sat slumped in his wheelchair, his face hidden behind a mask. He showed no emotion. He offered no reaction. He was a black hole of empathy, absorbing the immense pain in the room without a flicker of remorse. His silence was its own kind of cruelty, a final act of withholding, a refusal to grant his victims the simple, human decency of acknowledgement. But his silence did not matter. The voices of his survivors were the only thing that mattered in the room. They were speaking not for him, but for themselves, for each other, and for the dead. On the final day, Judge Michael Bowman handed down the sentence. He ordered Joseph James DeAngelo to serve multiple sentences of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The defendant deserves no mercy, the judge declared. Justice, after a 44-year wait, had finally been served. The Phantom was caged. He would spend the rest of his days locked away, stripped of his name, his freedom, and his power. The capture and conviction of Joseph James DeAngelo brought an end to one of the longest and most terrifying crime sprees in American history. Justice, delayed for over 4 decades, was finally delivered. The case of the Golden State Killer stands as a monumental testament to the relentless persistence of investigators and the revolutionary power of science. It proved that no case is ever truly cold, that no monster can hide forever. The genetic ghost that haunted California for a generation was finally given a name, a face, and a prison cell. The long silence that followed his final crime was broken not by him, but by the chorus of his survivors and the inescapable truth held within his own DNA. Today, in the year 2026, Joseph James DeAngelo is 80 years old. He is serving his sentence of life without the possibility of parole. He is housed in a protective custody unit at a state prison in California's Central Valley, isolated from the general population for his own safety. The man who once moved with impunity through the shadows of the Golden State will now spend his remaining days in a concrete box, a frail and forgotten relic of a violent past. His reign of terror is over. His power has been extinguished. He is no longer a phantom or a monster. He is simply an old man in a prison uniform, waiting for an end he denied to so many. The legacy of this case extends far beyond the prison walls. It has forever changed the landscape of criminal investigation. The pioneering use of forensic genetic genealogy, once a novel long shot, is now a standard tool for law enforcement, solving cold cases across the country, bringing closure to countless families. Yet, it also sparked a complex and ongoing debate about genetic privacy, consent, and the ethics of using public databases for police work. The capture of the Golden State Killer forced society to confront new questions about the balance between solving heinous crimes and protecting the privacy of our most personal information, a conversation that continues to this day. Ultimately, this is a story about the enduring nature of trauma and the remarkable resilience of the human spirit. For the victims and their families, the capture of DeAngelo did not erase the pain, but it offered a form of closure, a final chapter to a nightmare that had lasted a lifetime. It affirmed that their stories mattered, that their suffering was not forgotten. The saga of the Golden State Killer is a chilling reminder of the darkness that can hide in plain sight, behind a badge, next door. But it is also a powerful story of hope, a story of how a single, invisible thread of evidence, preserved by chance, pursued by relentless dedication, can finally lead justice out of the dark.